Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm your host of Cut the Crop. And today I have Dr. Harry Clark from the Greenhouse Gas Centre, and he's also a member of the New Zealand Climate Change Commission. Now, we did do an earlier podcast with Harry where we were talking about just the big global issues around climate change and the impact that global commitments could have on New Zealand. But this podcast, we want to drill right down to what does it mean for an arable farmer. So welcome, Harry.
Good to see you again, Alison.
Yes, I know. So I guess the starting point would be, because I think that the general public tends to think about agricultural greenhouse gas emissions from the perspective of methane emissions from livestock. But for an arable farmer, what are we talking about when we're talking about our greenhouse gas emissions?
It boils down to something very simple. The bulk of emissions on purely arable farms come from fertiliser use, and it's nitrous oxide emissions from fertiliser as they're applied. There are emissions from the manufacture and spreading of fertiliser. So literally on a purely arable farm, it all comes back to fertiliser applications, N fertiliser applications. And I mean, we have to, with arable farms, emissions are much less than on a livestock farm because it doesn't have that methane element. And also, in a sense, it's simpler from a management perspective. How do I manage my emissions? Well, I can focus on that one thing.
Yes.
Which is fertiliser.
I think that some work that FAR did, I think we worked out that, about 70% of an arable farm's emissions would come from the manufacture and application of nitrogen fertilisers. Now, obviously, the other 30%, where does that come from?
Well, there would be, fuel use on farms, tractor fuel use, your use in general transport, in drying, in processing of crops, but relatively small amounts compared to those nitrous oxide emissions. So the ones that you can control the most are the N fertiliser.
And so if you were comparing, say, a solely arable farm with, say, a dairy farm, what would be the difference in emissions? Is it like, I don't know, half or a quarter?
Or much less. If I look at the average dairy farm, the emissions are around about, and I put this into what they call CO2 equivalents when we try and put all the gases into a single unit, they're around about 10 tonnes per hectare. It's hard to see what the average arable farm is, but they would be certainly, I think, less than 2 tonnes a hectare. And if I looked at beef and sheep, 4 to 5 tonnes per hectare from a beef and sheep farm. Quite a wide range again compared to that less than 2, probably between 1.5 and 2 from an arable farm. So they, the emissions from arable operations are much less than in general from livestock operations, and it does come back to that methane issue, where the methane is a very potent gas, and it is a gas that comes out of ruminant animals' mouths. Yes. So arable doesn't have that methane emission. And some arable farms obviously do have livestock. There's quite a lot of mixed, but that big issue of methane does not generally arise to the same extent from arable farms.
Yes. And so we talked previously in the previous podcast about Hiwaka Ekanoa. Let's just revisit the targets that Hiwaka Ekanoa have sort of agreed to. Maybe just start off by a quick summary of what it is, and then the targets and what that means for an arable farmer.
Yeah. I mean, the principal targets for Hiwaka in the short term are every farmer to know their number. Which is, what are the emissions from your operation? And I from memory, by the end of this year, on average across the sector, 25% of farmers should know their number. And I think by the end of next year, it's getting close to 100%. And then in subsequent years, it's actually having a plan. It's let's actually have a plan, a more of a farm plan to say, how am I going to manage those emissions down? And by 2025, end of 2024, all farmers are going to have a plan as to how they are going to reduce their emissions. So initially, getting to know what your number is, but then moving towards actually having a management plan that within the management of your operations, you are looking to manage down your greenhouse gas emissions. So that's over the next 4 years. And I think, the average of 25% across the sectors is a relatively easy target to get to, because there are already, most dairy farms already have know their number through the use of overseer as a condition of milk supply. But I think, 100%, pretty challenging by, the end of next year. So I think that is the first challenge. Everyone get to know their number. And then then I need a plan, which is not just a greenhouse gas management plan. This is a farm plan, which includes broader environmental elements and has a greenhouse gas module. And that will be even more challenging as we go out towards 2025. But the commitment from Hiwaka Ekanoa is, again, 100% of farmers have a plan.
Yes. So if you are an arable farmer and you're listening in and you're going, I have no idea what my greenhouse gas number is, how do they calculate it?
Right. Well, and again, what Hiwaka Ekanoa is doing as part of its agreement with the government, and as far as this working arrangement it has, is to coming up with approved calculators, and those calculators will be more or less appropriate to different enterprises. At the moment, there's quite a lot. As I understand it, there are around about 10, but those will not necessarily all be applicable to the arable sector. There will be some that will be very applicable to the arable sector. So my advice is to actually go to someone like FAR and say, which one do you recommend we use? Because there will be several that can be used, but some will be more appropriate. And also there will be different levels, I think. Some will be quite complicated and some will be quite simple. And it really is... it's getting to know your number and looking to use an approved calculator that is the most appropriate to your enterprise. And I think you and FAR are going to be the ones who will be able to advise farmers on which is the most appropriate to their type of enterprise. Because there is going to be a bit of confusion, I think, that there are 10 calculators. Oh, which one do I use? And I think that will become more apparent which one is most appropriate to your farm. And I think that over time, it will also change. You may want in the early stages to think, well, I just need to get to know my number. And so you'll use something relatively simple. But as you move more towards getting a plan to manage down your emissions, you may want to move to a slightly more complex one that takes more into account how my individual actions change my number. Because some can be very simple. It may be just equivalent. I've got so many hectares. That's it. Others, well, what happens if I take this action? What does it mean for my emissions? But I think initially, get to know your number and do it in a way that's appropriate to your operation. And then think, in the longer term, I may need more complexity, but go for simplicity in the first place to get to know your number.
And so the challenge with all of this is, how does a levy organisation like FAR give its growers good advice and guidance around, what to do when so much of it is still up in the air? And so, what is this simple messaging that we can give to our growers that no matter what happens in the future, if they do these things, it will be of benefit to them?
You have my sympathies here because it is an evolving situation. It is uncertain. We've got this. I think it is a difficult issue. You want to be able to move forward with the sector, in engagement with the sector, but that takes time. And so there's uncertainty while that happens. But to me, the one where there is the least uncertainty is get to know your number. There will be several calculators, choose the most appropriate one and go down that route first. There will be other things coming along, But I think you could worry yourself silly about this, but I think at the moment, just do what you can do.
So as far as arable growers are concerned, our simple messaging really has to be around know your number. Most of it is linked to nitrogen fertilizer use. Therefore, your plan for managing greenhouse gas numbers is predominantly focused on managing nitrogen fertilizer.
Absolutely agree. And of course, that also fits in with other environmental concerns around water as well, because it ultimately does come back around to fertilizer as well. So in a sense, for arable farms, the message is relatively simple. Managing N fertilizer is the big. There's a little bit from lime as well. So, lime applications bring a bit, but it is about a fertilizer application. And then, as you say, in how you incentivize behavioral change, it becomes, well, can we do it in the simplest way possible?
Yes. We've spent quite a lot of time over the last couple of years developing a range of tools around nitrogen use efficiency. So for our growers, understanding how much mineralizable N is in the soil, understanding what the N requirement of a crop is, and getting your input of fertilizer matched with the crop
And I'm sure a lot of that is about the confidence, because it's always easy to think, I'll just put a bit more on for insurance, just in case. But it's the confidence to put the minimum amount on to get the outcome you want.
And so for an arable grower, if you think about it, you can meet your greenhouse gas commitments, you can meet your fresh water commitments, and hopefully you can reduce your input costs if you reduce your nitrogen fertilizer. And obviously still maintain productivity.
Yes, absolutely. It does seem quite a virtuous approach for a whole number of reasons. Really.
And given the fact that nitrogen fertilizers are actually getting more and more expensive, it actually makes sense that that's where the focus is. Yeah. So it's a really nice, simple message that we need to get out. And I know that, FAR has got a new sort of program of work, which is called Having the Confidence to Cut Back on Nitrogen Fertilizer Use. So this all sort of is a nice commentary to get out to our growers. And
I think also the going back to that issue, if there's any pricing mechanism, it will go on the price of fertilizer ultimately. So then there's another incentive. So the price is going up. So there's a strong incentive to reduce as well. So it's very, very, very all work in the same direction.
If you are an arable grower that is a mixed cropping livestock farmer, though, it all starts to get a little bit more complicated. This is where the decisions that are being made through Hiwaka Ekanoa have got to make sure that they're not focused solely on addressing the livestock sector's issues. And this is always a challenge that the arable sector has, that we want to do things together with the other sectors. We want to show a sort of pan-sector commitment, but the government tends to look at, who is the major polluter. Let's develop policies that will incentivize the major polluters to change, but some of those policies have unintended consequences for much more mixed systems.
You do wonder if there is now opportunities for more mixed systems. So when you think about trying to integrate environmental outcomes, and greenhouse gases being one of those, that one of the major emissions from livestock operations, it does come back through nitrous oxide emissions. And in livestock operations, it's not fertilizer that's the big issue. It's actually urine patches. It's the amount, because ruminants are very poor converters of nitrogen. They take in lots and excrete most of it. But is there some opportunity there with mixed livestock arable farms where we can change the diet of our ruminant animals? We can stop importing some feeds. We can feed lower end feeds. So are there opportunities coming around from exploiting mixed systems, perhaps more than we do now, to get those better environmental outcomes? And yes, they may be more complex, but is that something we should be looking to exploit, to better integrate our arable sector with our livestock sector to get better outcomes? And the obvious one to me is around feeding ruminants. We have grass will always, I think, for at least the foreseeable future, will be the main thing we use as the principal feed for ruminant animals. But there are other feeds that can have certain attributes that may impact both N leaching, may impact N excreta, and even decrease methane emissions. So to me, that we need to start exploring those opportunities whereby mixed arable systems may give us better outcomes at a broader scale.
So, I mean, we have done some work in that area, in that space, and so have other people. So there is research out there that has done exactly what you've said, but we do not seem to be able to get the livestock sectors to embrace this opportunity. And so that's the frustration, you see, that we have in the arable sector, is that we can see ways in which we can move New Zealand's farming systems forward into slightly more diversified, integrated systems that would get New Zealand a tick in a lot of boxes. But we're struggling to get, sectors who have a particular business model that they're working to want to change.
It's that inflexibility within those rules or business model. I think the only way you can get around that is by communication and working that through. But you can see how this arises. It's a one size fits all. Here's the rule.
It's the unintended consequences of one set of rules potentially closing down an opportunity.
Yeah. But I think we do have to keep pushing this, because we actually look at, we feed our ruminants far too much nitrogen in their feed. And thinking about alternatives to pasture, I think, is something we have to consider. We have to say, well, yes, we've always done that, but is that what we will do in the future? Are there ways that we can exploit the synergies between enterprises to get better outcomes for both? And I think we do need to think a little bit beyond what we've traditionally done. We're faced with new challenges, across the whole of the environment, with its biodiversity through to N leaching, greenhouse gases. And we are going to have to think differently. We're going to have to look at, do our traditional systems still fit within our current requirements? And it may well be, in most cases they do, but let's see where there are opportunities to exploit those synergies, and we need to keep working at that. We're still, I think, quite early in the piece in this, and I think we'll see some perverse consequences and some perverse incentives, but I think we just have to keep working at it, because we're only just really embracing this. It's the agricultural sector has been aware of the issue, but has not had to actually do anything. There have not been any targets on agriculture, whereas the rest of the economy has been in an emissions trading scheme. Agriculture was sitting outside that. Agriculture is going to come into some sort of pricing mechanism. So I think the incentives for change are coming in, and I think we will see change over time, but it will take some time. But I noticed the complete differences in 10 to 15 years from, well, we don't believe it, to it's not our problem, to what we can do about it. Yeah. And I think that's a big change. And I think that's what will be driving what happens in the next 10 years.
And I think that's a really nice way to sort of finish off, in the sense, what can we do about it? And the take-home message from you and from me for arable growers is know your number. And FAR can help you decide on what is the best tool to use to work out your number. And given the fact that we know that nitrogen fertiliser is our biggest factor in driving our emissions profile, let's start working on how we can manage that nitrogen utilisation down.
I think you've got a single point of focus. I think that's a really great advantage, and is a good way to finish. Focus on nitrogen.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, Harry.
You're very welcome, Alison.
Thank you, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.